today, earlier, I posted on Substack a note, which maybe some of you have seen, and I'll basically summarize it. So I was about 19. It was 1970 or 71. Maybe I was 20. I don't remember right now. But in those days, in that period, I was a member of the Hare Krishna movement. And, for people my age, we all remember the exuberance of all the young Hare Krishna devotees as they chanted on the streets and opened temples everywhere. And I spent a couple of years in that movement, and it decisively shaped my life. Ever since, I've always had a deep affection and reverence for Hinduism and for Krishna and for the other Hindu deities and for Hindu scriptures, Bhagavad Gita, Upanishads. And that has never left me, and that actually still deeply shapes me. In fact, we just spent almost 6 months at Yoga Vidya, which is an ashram in an ashram community, actually in Germany, and that was a very enriching experience to be able to meditate daily, engage in satsang and aritis. So a very deep experience. Well, I'm back in Virginia right now, and I'll be recording from here or uploading from here. So it was about 1970 or 71, and I had been reading the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads. And one evening, as I was out somewhere, I don't even remember where it was now, standing by, I remember there was a school bus, though, at that I remember, a yellow school bus. And I was dressed in traditional Indian clothing because that's how the Hare Krishnas dressed in those days, which was so surprising to people on the street. And I don't know what I was thinking at the time, but suddenly I was filled with a sensation that I could only describe as coming directly out of the Upanishads. There was this sensation of fullness, of exuberance, of eternal delight. And it played through me like clouds passing through my body, gentle, buttery clouds passing through my body. And I felt this sense of extraordinary elation. I felt as if I had almost been vaporized and that I had transcended to the level of the great devas, the great deities. It was a wonderful experience of freedom, of peace, of joy, of certainty, and of knowing that the divine is the ground of our lives. And the odd thing is that only took about a quarter of a second, as I recall. All of that was revealed in a quarter of a second, and I never forgot it. And and to this day, that represents for me the very spirit, the teaching, the essence of the Upanishads. So later, of course, I engaged the Upanishads much more deeply, and today I would say that there are many sentences, many statements in the Upanishads that I could quote, but the one that always comes to mind when I think about that experience is an old expression from the Upanishads that, and suddenly it's escaping me. I don't know how it could escape me, but just give me a moment. Right. Verily, all of this certainly is Brahman. Sarvam idam kalvidam Brahma. All of this is certainly Brahman. There's nothing else but Brahman. Everything is Brahman. And that's a key statement in the Upanishads. And it's one that is quite inspiring, and just that one sentence alone is worth practically the whole of human philosophical and religious and theological questing for knowledge. Because if we reflect upon that, if we reverently reflect upon that saying, that Mahavakya, that statement from the Upanishads, it will illumine us. And it will lead us deeply into Brahman, into being, and into a direct encounter with Brahman, with being, with what ultimately is real. Now, that was my first conscious adult encounter with what we in Western philosophy call being, and there are many words for being: ousia, ens, and so many other words, also in other languages as well. But the word doesn't really matter that much. the word being is for me a lovely word. I find that the word Brahman is more evocative, but being is also evocative, and the Greek word ousia is also evocative. But it doesn't matter what word we use. We know this from the Neoplatonists, and we also know this from the Nirguna Brahman statements in the Upanishads, that whatever being is, whatever Brahman is, not only does it exceed what we can say about it, which is actually a cliche. I mean, when you read any mystical literature, after a while, you encounter that statement all the time. It not only does it exceed anything that we can say about it, but it's actually the summation of all of our experience, because it's the ground of our experience. It's that out of which we live. And often our faces are turned away from it. But when we turn through contemplation and meditation to being, to Brahman, it shows itself to us. And this is what happened to me in that moment many years ago. And that's been repeated in my life in an ever deepening way over the decades. And one of the fruits of the contemplative life, when it's practiced over many decades, and when we try to stay true to the rhythm of consolation and desolation, to use language from the Jesuit tradition, when we try to stay true through the periods of elation and the periods of unknowing, we find that there's a kind of a path that emerges before us, and that as we walk that path, we become more and more vehicles and conscious channels of ultimate reality. And there's nothing new or odd about that statement from a standpoint of the great mystical teachings of the world's spiritual and religious and philosophical traditions. It may sound odd if you were to suddenly start talking about that to the person next to you on the plane, or, I don't know, walking through the neighborhood. But it only sounds odd in that context. It is actually ultimate wisdom, and it's expressed in many dialects and many different traditions. So what happened then is, and I'll run. I'm not going to run through the whole biography here. It's really not relevant. But in the early '80s, I was a grad student at Harvard, and I worked on a number of degrees there, a couple of master's degrees and a PhD in the study of religion. And of course, that was a great opportunity to read, think, and reflect for those years. It's a great gift, and I'm really honored that I was able to have that experience. And I spent early in that period, in the early '80s, I discovered a couple of books in a Catholic, very conservative Catholic bookstore in Harvard Square, that were recommended to me by the person who was the owner or the clerk. And I bought both of them at the same time. And one of them was called The Unity of Philosophical Experience, and the other one is called Being and Some Philosophers. Now, admittedly, that latter title isn't very promising, Being and Some Philosophers, but it's pretty accurate. It describes the book very well, very nicely. The Unity of Philosophical Experience, both of these books were written by Étienne Gilson, a French Thomist who was quite prominent a century ago, and in the last century, and actually was one of the figures who helped to bring Thomism and Scholasticism back into the philosophical mainstream. And I didn't know much about Gilson at the time when I first read the books, but I was intrigued by them. And the lesson that I learned from these books, it took some time for me to take it on board. But Gilson was adamant, and this was almost like the one theme that runs through all of his books, and these books, and that is that if we identify being with a being, then we have lost being. And instead of actually encountering being itself, we've transformed being into something other than being, even while we call that being. So to make that a little bit more simple, if whatever we identify as ultimate reality, if it's not the ultimate reality itself, it becomes a distraction from ultimate reality. And Gilson, as one of the notable historians of philosophy of the 20th century, in both of these books shows how Virtually all Western philosophers made the mistake of identifying being with something less than being itself, with a being. And for the Platonists, this would be to identify in his reading and he was, of course, firmly opposed to Platonism. He was a staunch Thomistic Aristotelian. So on this view, the failure of Platonists and all of their ilk is that as essentialists, they identify being with concepts or ideas, essential ideas, formal ideas, not Lockean representational ideas, but ideas in the robust Platonic Aristotelian sense of noetically perceived forms that actually provide the underlying shaping power for the physical world and for our minds. Those are formal ideas, Platonic ideas, and they're different for Aristotle. They're related. They have that noetic quality, although for Aristotle they're never separable from their physical instantiations. So that was for Gilson, that was one of the great errors in Western philosophy, essentialism. Of course, logicism and mathematicism, and certainly physicalism. All of these are attempts to create a metaphysics that's actually a false metaphysics, because it gives the status of being to something that is a being that is not being itself. So this is a profound dialectical move, and if you were to read both of these books, you would see just how effortlessly he is able to uncover this flaw in these approaches. He's able to pursue what Heidegger referred to as the ontological difference, which is the difference between being and beings. Now, as much as I've read these books throughout the 80s multiple times, I've read them multiple times since then. They're among the most read books in my library, and now I read them in electronic form. The paper books, the printed books, have virtually fallen apart, and I think I've underlined probably every word in them except for the conjunctions. Yes, so. Unfortunately, I think that Gilson himself fell into his own trap, and that is that he identifies being, and it took me a long time to appreciate this. He identifies being with esse, which is the existence, pure existence, and as applied to God. God is understood as purus actus, which means God is the perfect act. God actualizes, vitalizes all formalisms, all Platonic ideas, which are merely formal entities in logical space, are actually inutile, ineffective, and merely logical entities until they are vitalized by existence itself. And so this is why Gilson is known as an existential Thomist. And given the decades in which he worked, it's actually that's a quite fitting term for him, an existential Thomist. And so what God is, what Deus is purus actus. That means that God is the absolute totalization, absolute actualization of every possible entity, of every formal idea. This is a massively impressive and influential vision of God, and it's quite moving. It's quite deep. But as a Platonist at heart, I've never actually been able to actually finally buy into the idea that existence in some way has ultimate status. And that's where I think, for me, sad to say, Gilson, I have to part company with him, because I actually think that being fundamentally is essence. It's not esse, it's not existence, it's fundamentally essence. It's, as the Upanishad says, Om Purnam Purnamidam, etc. That reality is utter fullness. It's fullness of form. It's fullness not just of random actualizations of form, but it is purely formal in itself. And And so, of course, it can be actualized, but being itself as this absolute fullness that never exhausts itself far transcends existence, even in its most extensive and actualized form. So that's where I parted company with Gilson. But later I started to realize that actually there was another great philosopher of being in the 20th century. I mean, being as being. And that was Heidegger. And it took me a lot longer to come around to Heidegger. And of course, he's a controversial figure. And that also adds to the difficulty in reading him with a kind of a good conscience. Nevertheless, virtually every progressive theological movement in the 20th century was deeply shaped by Heideggerian thought, starting with Bultmann and coming through Rahner, and even down to today to figures like Marion and others. So Heidegger, as an ontologist, as a thinker, as a philosopher of being, is actually unparalleled in the 20th century, perhaps in the last millennium, half millennium at least, since until we go back to the ontologists. And in this case, actually, I think Heidegger goes a step farther than Gilson. It's apocryphal, perhaps. I read it somewhere. I don't know where I read it, where it is, but I read somewhere once that when Gilson would hear Heidegger speak, he would weep. I don't know if that's a true story, but it's a very fitting story. There's also a story about Quine. And Quine, Willard Van Orman Quine, the great philosophy professor at Harvard, he was a grad student or in the Society of Fellows during the period when Gilson was a luminary at Harvard, where he was invited frequently, and he gave the Unity of Philosophical Experience lectures in 1936 at Harvard's tercentenary, and he I won't repeat it here because actually times have changed, but he had a kind of mocking way of talking about Gilson and his notion of being. You can look that up somewhere. I think it's actually in his autobiography, which I read a couple of years ago. Really great autobiography, by the way. I have to say that I also deeply admire Quine, and I really enjoy reading him. And he revolutionized analytic philosophy. He pushed it away from positivism and back towards metaphysics, and opened the path for philosophers like David Lewis and Saul Kripke. So to come back to the point where Heidegger and with his notion of the ontological difference, which some say he abandoned in later years, but I was just reading some of his later seminars that he gave in France in the 60s and early 70s, and he actually refers to the ontological difference there. Regardless of whether he can continue to use it, it's an extremely important concept. The ontological difference essentially states that being is not identical with a being. And no being can be being itself. And that might sound like an abstraction to some people, even a useless abstraction. But of course, to someone for whom the physical world is being, then to call it being is really sort of superfluous. So we don't need that term if we're pure physicalists. And of course, right there, we see that's the issue that Gilson raised, and that also Heidegger raised. And a being has been identified with something that's not being, and then it blocks our path back to being. And this gives rise to Seinsvergessenheit. One of Heidegger's great concepts, Seinsvergessenheit, that means the forgetfulness of being. And this is such a moving statement. And perhaps it was this that led Gilson to tears if that event actually occurred. Because it's this forgetfulness of being that plagues Western philosophy for the last centuries. And now actually with the rise of AI and our completely technological lifestyles, look what I'm doing here. I mean, anybody with a Substack has basically the same tools that a major network had 20 years ago. I'm right. I could be somewhere going live with a report 25 years ago with equipment that would have cost millions of dollars. And here I am sitting in my house with a $300 Android phone, and I have the same power as CBS did 25 years ago. So we can't escape the technology, but we can also try to overcome Seinsvergessenheit, this forgetfulness of being, by turning our attention back to being itself. And then we'll discover that being is not an abstraction, actually, in merely as a conceptual item in a philosophical analysis or an argument. Yes, it can be reduced to that, but in fact, it is not just a concept. And if I don't get to it in this video, because I don't want to overwhelm everyone with a lot of words, I may get to it in the next video. But so where Heidegger himself is an interesting case, because his whole philosophy can be understood as his whole philosophical career can really be understood as a quest for being itself. And this is what makes him so important as a philosopher in the last few centuries. And that's what will remain as his importance in the centuries to come. I read somewhere that Heidegger said, and I'm sure the Heidegger scholars can find it quickly, that he believed that his time was a few centuries into the future. And that's actually true for many great philosophers, is that they're not often appreciated in their times. And in his case, he was involved in controversial matters, and other philosophers in the past have been as well. So it may be that in a couple of centuries, there will be a different I can't imagine the evaluations will change, but his ontology and his ontological observations will probably become more salient as time goes on. And so he was a philosopher of being, but he also changed his mind about what he thought being was. And Being and Time, in those first pages of Being and Time, any philosopher of being gets excited reading them, because you think, oh, here we're going to have an encounter with being itself. And then, in my view, I always get disappointed, because it seems when he talks about Dasein and temporality, and of course Dasein, or the human being, it's so anthropocentric in that sense. It's focused upon human beings. Human beings become the locus, the place where being presences itself, but through temporality. And so this is where I always get off the boat, because as a person who has deeply read the Upanishads and has practiced Buddhist and Hindu and Christian meditation diligently and lovingly over the centuries, I'm not interested in time ultimately. I see time as, I'm more of a Kantian in that respect. It's just, it's one of the forms of sensibility. It's not part of reality itself. It's just a kind of filtering device that these brains use in order to break reality up into more easily digestible bits and pieces. So that's where I would always. I just couldn't go any further. But then over time, I began to discover the later Heidegger, and here is really an interesting series of writings. His book, What is Thinking, is profound. It is a book that if you read that, you will realize that here was a person who was entering deeply into meditative thinking of the kind that we find in the great mystical philosophers in Buddhism, Hinduism, and in the Christian, Jewish, and Islamic traditions. Excuse me. I highly recommend a meditative reading of what is called thinking. Back to Heidegger. So what happened with Heidegger is that he actually realized very quickly that he had fallen into violating the ontological difference himself. And so over the next decade or so, he began to develop away from that earlier existentialist phenomenological approach. And he began to become more of a mystic and a poet. And to really understand Heidegger, I've discovered reading writers like Richard Capobianco and John Caputo, that as interpreters of Heidegger, it's clear that to understand him, you really need to understand the religious developments in Europe and Germany over the last centuries. Because the later Heidegger is actually easy to understand once you get past the obscure language, if you have a deep deep training in the writings of mysticism, European mysticism, Meister Eckhart and others. And on the horizon of Heidegger's thought, he began to have encounters with Buddhist monks. There's a video online, YouTube, of an interview with a Thai monk, I believe, or a Theravada monk. And of course, the Kyoto School is deeply interested in Heidegger's thought. And he himself never really referenced Buddhism, but one can sense that had he lived another 10 or 15 years, he might have been part of those exchanges that began to happen since the 70s in the West with Buddhist teachers from multiple traditions. And so when we read the later Heidegger, it's actually quite moving when we see that he's essentially engaging in the critique of what in Vedanta is called saguna conceptions of Brahman in light of what is called nirguna, the nirguna conception of Brahman. Or to use language from the Western mystical tradition, Heidegger seems often to be an apophatic philosopher who is trying to not let cataphatic conceptions of God or the divine stand in the way of that ultimate freedom of being itself. That ultimate freedom of being, which eludes and escapes any form of substantialization or essentialization, because it's fullness, and that's the idea from the Upaniṣads. But also in Madhyamaka Buddhism, there's that utter freedom of being itself, of existence of self, of what is as it is, whatever it is, that just escapes being captured by any formalism of any sort. And one senses that Heidegger, unlike Gilson, had clearly, intuitively perceived this being as that which eludes, that which transcends, that which moves beyond every net of physicality or conceptuality, every subtle body expression. It eludes all of them while at the same time. And here's the element where the mystics are so important. It eludes all of that while being its ground. And when here's, of course, Meister Eckhart, while by being the ground of all of this, by being the sponsoring ground of whatever it is that arises, all of this is truly Brahman. And when we start to take that on board, we realize that there's no death. There's no time, there's no space. Sure, I mean, I'm obviously sitting here in 2026, June something, and I'm talking with this physical form here, but that's just a kind of it's a temporary paste on job. It's a kind of something, a layering over of what we actually are. And not to diminish that, because this is also to be cherished and taken care of. And the notion of care, of sorge, but it's not ultimate. And there's where our freedom is, when we know that this is not ultimate, but the ultimate resides within us, that being itself, Brahman, ultimate reality, is living, it's real, it's vital, but it's not capturable in any of the forms that we would apply to it. So Heidegger was far more consistent in that regard, and that's why I do find it exciting to read his later writings. His earlier writings are of less interest to me, and I ultimately read them in light of the various mystical traditions that I've practiced as a contemplative. So a final point before I go off here now, I just want to give a sense of what I might talk about the next time. So this can sound quite conceptual. It can sound as if I'm just doing philosophy, maybe of a traditional kind or a continental kind, and not hardcore analytic scientific metaphysics, empirical metaphysics, and I'm not doing any of that. This is, if you will, this is a priori metaphysics. This is the sort of thing that Hume, in that violent image in which one can still feel the persecutions of the Middle Ages of heretics, where Hume says that any a priori metaphysics, any book of a priori metaphysics or theology should be cast into the flames. Well, I'm doing a priori metaphysics here for sure. That is for sure, because when one analyzes a statement like all of this is truly Brahman, that can be empirically verified, I suppose. And let me take that back a bit, but it's making a claim about reality that's not dependent upon first being a generalization from empirical experience. It's a claim that comes right out of the very unitive, non-dual nature of reality itself. If reality, if being is non-dual, then it follows logically a priori that nothing is excluded from being or Brahman. And instead of being a useless statement, that's actually a profoundly consoling and helpful and constructive thought, because it can help us to rebuild our spiritual lives and our spiritual identity over against the flat land of technologism in which we all now live. So, what I want to do next time is to show how an a priori metaphysics is also a contemplative metaphysics. And that's what I'll talk about the next time. So I'm just going to try to see if I can stop this. Oh, yeah, there's the end button at the top. Now that I've done it, it's been a lot of fun. I'll spend some more time figuring out how it all works. So the next time it'll have a little bit more professionalism. So take care. See you around. Be well.